Anyone who's spent a little bit of time lure fishing and has spent a bit of time in fishing circles has no doubt heard the term, if there's no run, there's no fun, which of course is relating to the movement and the flow of water and the relationship between fish behaviour and fishing opportunities, I guess, and water flow and water movement. But just how true is it? I mean, if we take that saying in its most literal sense, we wouldn't even bother going and casting a lure if there's no tide or no river flow or no wind. So today we're going to explore that no run, no fun theory and just flesh it out a little bit, because often I think as anglers we oversimplify. We take a one-size-fits-all approach and we apply a rule willy-nilly across a whole range of scenarios, and potentially we miss opportunities because we just fail to recognise them, or we've convinced ourselves that because there's no water movement, the fish aren't going to be biting, so we don't put a lot of effort in. We don't have confidence when we're on the water. So brace yourself for another solo rant, and on that note, let's get the intro music out of the way.
This is the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast, where our mission is to help everyday sports fishers experience extraordinary lure fishing. If next level fishing is your dream, then let us provide the tools and information that will bring that dream to life. Tune in as our expert hosts chat with Australia's best anglers and share their tips for success. Then check out our website. It's one of Australia's largest and most popular online fishing resources. But right now, settle in to listen as ALF founder Greg Doc Lures Vinall delivers today's episode through the nerdy lens of a scientist, lure maker, and sport fishing tragic.
Well, welcome ALF listeners, and especially Team Doc Lures members, because you guys seriously rock. Thank you so much for your support and for helping to keep the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast on air. I hope you're enjoying the members' content and the tools and resources. So folks, as I said at the start prior to the intro music, today we're going to be talking about water movement and how that affects fish behaviour, and not just fish behaviour, but our behaviour as anglers, how we go about trying to catch fish on lures in periods where there's high flow or periods when there's no flow at all. So we're going to test the hypothesis that if there's no run, there's no fun, which is essentially a statement that says that fishing opportunity is directly related to flow conditions. Now, as a scientist, of course, I've got to also explore the null hypothesis, because if the null hypothesis isn't also true, then we haven't really reached a solid conclusion. So what is the null hypothesis in this case? Well, the null hypothesis would be that water movement has no bearing on fishing opportunities. So just to get it clear in my own head, because I'm rambling a bit, the hypothesis is fishing opportunities are directly related to water flow. The null hypothesis is there's no direct correlation between water flow and opportunities to catch fish. So we're going to go and explore some of the issues around that over the course of this discussion and see if we can come to a firm conclusion. Now, as a limnologist and as an avid lure fisher, I've spent countless hours observing and studying and thinking about the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways that flow and also water temperature influence fish behaviour and affect what kinds of habitat that they tend to stick around in. But also I've given a lot of thought to how as anglers we change our approach based on the flow conditions. And some of these are super obvious. I mean, if you think about, top end runoff barramundi fishing, for example, you'd be hard pressed if you want to try and book a trip in the 2024 runoff season now to get up there and get out with a guide, because there's been massive rainfall up there. We're all anticipating massive flooding, massive runoff towards the end of the wet season, and that's going to cause huge feeding frenzies of barramundi at all of the feeder creek mouths and out around the coastal areas outside of the river mouths. Because perhaps the worst kept secret in fishing is that when you get good flows at the top end, you get good barramundi fishing. You get prawns flushed out, you get a good prawn fishery, you get increased spawning and recruitment of barramundi into the system on those big wet seasons. And conversely, if you have a wet season where you have below average rainfall, then the opposite's true. The feeding frenzies, the accumulation of barramundi or the aggregation of barramundi at the feeder creek mouths, all of that stuff happens on a far smaller scale if you have a drier kind of a wet season. So that's a really clear example of where flow influences fish behaviour and influences fishing opportunity, one that we all know really, really well. Other examples might be fishing for jewfish around the mouths of rivers during floods, or they might be fishing for lots of estuarine species that tend to go down towards the mouth of the system, down towards the front where there's salt water coming in on the tides during periods of rainfall. And of course, the flip side is also true, that anglers know during periods of low rainfall, when the estuaries tend to get more salt pushing up on the tide, that the fish tend to move further and further up into the system. This is the species that like brackish saline water, that is. Another good example, I guess, is fish migration in response to flow events. So we know that lots of freshwater fish move upstream during flood events because they're looking for areas where the water spills out onto floodplains for spawning. Or we know that saltwater species, for example, will migrate on the East Australian current, which is a major flow event down the east coast of Australia that brings tropical species down into temperate zones each year. So what we're talking about here is really gross, obvious changes in behaviour or changes in movement that are associated with flow events. And I think as anglers, we're pretty much mostly across a lot of that. We know what time of year to find fish at particular locations. We know what time of year they migrate to particular areas. So I don't really want to focus too much on that in today's podcast episode. What I'd rather do is focus on the smaller scale stuff. And by that, I'm referring to more localized stuff that, typically when we get to a riverbank or we get to a reef or we get to a lake or something like that, these are the effects, or these are the flow effects and the temperature effects that will help us to determine where the fish are going to be, or not help us to determine, it'll actually determine where the fish position themselves and how they're behaving, whether they're feeding, whether they're hunkering down, what they're doing. But clearly, if we understand fish behavior and we understand how these currents work, then that gives us a lot of clues about where we should fish and when and how we should fish as well. And I suppose that brings me to my first point in this exploration of the term no run, no fun, and that is water movement has a tendency to cause food items, whether they're bait fish or prawns or any kind of morsels that fish might eat, it causes them to be kind of accumulated in particular areas, and that creates feeding zones. And we've already talked about the feeder creeks that flow into main river systems in the top end. So if there's not much water flowing out of those billabongs and lagoons and salt marshes and low-lying areas, then there's nothing to actually wash those bait items, those food items, out into the main river channel where the fish are waiting for them, or the mouths of the creeks where the fish are waiting for them. And once again, there's lots of examples. And in many cases, it's because the bait species, whether they're fish or prawns or crabs or whatever they might be, aren't as strong as swimmers as the predators that are trying to eat them. And I guess two things happen. One is they get swept along on the current because it's too strong for them to swim against, and they get swept into places where predators are waiting for them and waiting to ambush them. Or alternatively, they find these little refuges in the ecosystems where they can get out of the current. And it might be on the lee side of a point or on the lee side of a piece of structure where the current is less strong and they can get out of it. It might be somewhere where the water's just circling around. So you get a little embayment as the water flows past. It causes that back eddy. And within that back eddy, you have areas where the current's not so strong. Quite often, that area will be between the water that's flowing north and the water that's flowing south, or east and west, however it might be in the system you're looking at. But you have water flowing in two different directions. And then right in between, there's this kind of slack water. And often the bait species will congregate in there because the current's not strong and they can actually hold station. Similar things can happen obviously behind bridge pylons as well, or rocky outcrops, or if you're fishing the coastal areas, places where there are bommies or reefs or whatever that are hit by a current, same sort of thing can happen. So there's these little current refuges where the bait fish aggregate because they can, as I said, they can handle the flow, they can hold station there. But what happens is every now and then one of them gets swept away by the current, it gets too far out of that slack water area, gets swept away by the current and picked off by a predator. And of course, the predators know where these aggregation areas are as well. And having bigger tails, more musculature, the predators are able to swim in a current much more easily. And so they'll ambush those bait fish and prawns that are holed up in that eddy. So it's a great place to look for predators, is anywhere that you see water flowing in two different directions, flowing side by side. Now, that can be in a river, it can be in an estuary, it can happen in a coastal area, it can happen on a headland, it can happen in a lake as well, right? So look for those places because there's always going to be bait accumulated there and predators are always going to gather there. And it's what quite often you'll hear guests on the podcast referring to as a pressure point or a pressure edge or a pinch point. It's somewhere where the bait are kind of trapped by flow velocities around them, and they can stay in this one little space, and the predators can easily come and pick them off. Now, if you're fishing a river system, then usually the flow in the main channel is in one direction only, okay? So you get eddies, back eddies that happen in these little embayments and on bends and places where there's a bit of structure and that kind of stuff. But the main flow is in one direction. In estuaries and in bays and in inlets, it's a little bit different because the flow can be bidirectional. Obviously, it flows in one direction on the incoming tide and in the opposite direction on the outgoing tide. And so in a river system, the fish can hold station. The predatory fish, our target species, can hold station where that current shear occurs, and they can continue to feed all day. Estuary systems are a bit different though. They're a little bit more dynamic because obviously once that flow changes direction, you go through a period at the top of the tide or at the bottom of the tide where there is no flow. Of course, often referred to as slack water, but during that slack water period, the bait species can disperse because they don't have strong currents holding them there anymore. They don't need to be at that interface between water flowing one direction and water flowing another. They can move around and they can forage and they can prepare themselves for the change of tide when the water's going to be flowing in the opposite direction. And that's why quite often in tidal systems, there's a bit of a lull in the bite. I suspect that's why there's a bit of a lull in the bite around the top and the bottom of the tide. There's not much water movement. The bait have dispersed. The predators have to work a little bit harder to find the bait and chase down individual fish instead of finding them all aggregated in schools. And quite frankly, I think the predators know better. It's not worth the energy to go around picking off individual bait fish. You may as well just wait for that tide to turn, take up station where that eddy is going to reform in the opposite side of the piece of structure or the opposite side of the embayment, and feed to your heart's content once the bait have re-established as a bait ball or a school. So it wouldn't surprise me if the origin of the term no run, no fun in part came from that lull in the bite that often happens around slack water. Now, it's not that way for all species. I know a lot of anglers look forward to the turn of the tide. I personally love the turn of the tide, but usually I like the kind of hour or two before and the hour or two after. And there's a period often of around 20, 30 minutes in between where you may as well have a cup of coffee, sit back and relax and wait for the action to heat up again. And I guess the other factor you need to weigh up if you're talking about water movement as a result of tides, as we are at the moment, is that tidal movement varies tremendously around Australia. So, there are parts of Australia where the tidal range is maybe a little bit over a metre, not much more than that, maybe even less. There are other parts of Australia where it's 6, 7, 8 metres between high and low tide. So there's a lot of difference in the water movement. Now, depending on the nature of the waterway through which that water is flowing, if you're fishing ocean reefs, a 1 metre tidal range might not be causing too much water movement, whereas a 6, 7, 8 metre tidal range could be creating quite a bit of water movement. On the other hand, if you're fishing a small creek system, it's only shallow, then 1 metre of tide change could cause some substantial flows within that creek system. And obviously, bigger tidal ranges can cause some tremendous flows. And that's why quite often in northern Australia, some of the neap tides, where the difference between high and low tide is greatly reduced, tend to be great times to fish because there's still water movement, there's still flow. It's still enough to be able to aggregate bait species and aggregate predators into feeding zones, but it's not flowing so fast and so dirty that you can't even get a lure near a fish and present it in a natural kind of a way because you've got to weight it so heavily. That doesn't mean that bait species aren't there, and it doesn't mean that predators aren't there. It's quite likely there are still fish there, but as anglers, we struggle to fish in really strong tides effectively, keep our lure where it's in front of the fish's face and present it naturally. And in fact, for fish, those big currents often aren't such a problem. You see, we're looking at currents as they affect us at the water surface, but if you're a fish, you can be right down near the bottom. Now, even if there's no structure, then just frictional forces actually slow the flow of water down to the bottom. This is a flathead strategy, right? Get as low down, as close to the bottom as you can, even though the water might be whistling over, in the water column above you. It's not really affecting you down at the bottom where the flow is much slower. And if you've got a sort of streamlined body shape like a flathead, that water pressure could actually be holding you to the bottom anyway. So the problem with lure presentation is that often during those high flow periods, the fish are down deep where they can get out of the current, and we're at the water surface. So to get a lure down there, we've got line that's stretching from the surface to the bottom, and that line is exposed to high flow, particularly up near the surface. That flow picks the line up, drags the lure up at the bottom. So we really struggle to get the lure down there, even though the fish are quite happily, often lazily feeding, even though the current's quite strong. And if you think about it, if you're sitting out of the current and the current's really flowing strong above you, it's going to be bringing even more food down to here, right? So small bait fish and prawns that can't swim against the current, well, in those really strong flow conditions, they're going to be swept away more often. And if you've got a nice sheltered place that you can just dart out of and grab them, then yeah, you're in for an easy feed, relatively speaking, for a fish. So far, we've talked about tides, but let's pivot this discussion across and head in on a different tangent, I guess. Let's talk a little bit about fishing in lakes and ponds and places where there isn't strong tidal flow like you'd see in an estuary. So the water's not being moved in huge volumes by the moon like it does in estuary systems or coastal systems. But you still have currents in lakes and inlets and ponds and the like, reservoirs. And sometimes those currents are actually surprisingly strong. They can even be visible. You can see where these currents are. You might see a line of flotsam or jetsam, or you might see bubble trails or some sort of sign that there's a kind of current. You might see smooth water sometimes marking where a current is. And typically these currents are created not by inflowing water, unless you're in a storage, it's got a river channel running through it and some water flowing in. That happens, of course. But if you're in a system that doesn't have tidal flow, doesn't have inflowing water to create those currents, then wind becomes the predominant driver of currents. And this is really important because if you think about it, in a pond or an impoundment, if you don't have some kind of current, then there wouldn't be any mixing of different temperature waters or different nutrient concentrations or anything else that's going on in the lake. Everything would be kind of very localized and patchy. But because you have currents that are created largely by the wind, you do get some mixing. Obviously, if you have a thermocline, the mixing only extends down so far, but that surface layer gets mixed by wind action. And that's important for keeping the water oxygenated. It's important for distributing nutrients. It's important for distributing bait and a whole range of other reasons as well. Now, the challenge in lake systems is that I've just said, the currents can be visible, but they're not always. In fact, probably more often than not, you've got to figure out what those currents are doing. And not only can they be flowing in any direction, but they can also be flowing vertically as well as horizontally. Okay, you get upwellings and downwellings. You get this in estuaries and rivers as well, and coastal areas. But certainly with the wind, you get all kinds of strange effects going on with the currents, all kinds of turbulence that can be happening. And so as an angler, you have to really be thinking about, well, what movement of water is going on here? And where does that mean that the bait are going to be accumulated and aggregated? And where are the fish going to be going to hunt and feed? Because all of those things that I've just discussed about bait aggregating in areas where they're sheltered from high flows, that happens in lakes as well. It's not just in estuaries and in oceans. So if you can figure that out, then you know where to fish. And in lake systems, it comes down to looking at the shape of the lake, looking at if you've got bathymetric information from navionics or something like that, having a bit of a look at that, and then looking at what the wind is doing now, but not just right this moment, what it's been doing over the last few days. Because the factors that affect how water flows in a lake system basically come down to the strength of the wind, the direction of the wind, the duration that it's been blowing from that direction, and the extent, the area of water. The more water it has to blow over, the stronger the currents can get. So wind that's been blowing from one direction for a period of time, strong wind that's been blowing from one direction for a period of time, can definitely set up some really strong currents within a lake system. If the wind's been variable and changing direction on a daily basis or coming up and dying down, those currents don't form as strongly. If the wind's been blowing for several days really hard and then it stops, the currents have inertia, so they continue to flow for some period of time, could be several days after the wind dies down, that water movement can still be going on. And once you understand that, figuring out where to fish in a lake comes down to the same factors that we talked about as fishing in estuaries and rivers, that you look for those current breaks, you look for those pinch points, those pressure points, because the water's circulating around in bays and creating back eddies just the same as it does with a tide or with river flow. The water is hitting structure and points and weed banks and all kinds of things and creating back eddies and backwashes and places where there are current breaks just the same as it does in rivers and estuaries. And so you can figure it out, but it's not necessarily as obvious as when you're fishing in flowing water systems where there's actual surface flow. So that's key in any lake, dam, storage system where you're fishing for just about any species. Doesn't matter whether it's trout in Tasmania, barramundi in Northern Australia, or bass on the Central East Coast. All of the lake systems are the same in that they're driven by water movement, they're driven by flow, and that flow is created by the wind, unless, of course, you've got major inflow happening as a result of flood events or whatever. And naturally, that brings up the question, well, what about when you are fishing tidal systems or flowing water systems and you've got strong wind as well? How does that all come together? Well, it's a great question. It's one that astute anglers will ask themselves before they leave home, because they're going to have a look and see, well, which way has the wind been blowing over the last few days? Let me have a quick look at Google Earth or Google Maps or Navionics and look for points, look for bays, look for places where wind-driven currents are going to create refuges and current breaks and all that kind of stuff in association with tidal flow and river flow. Because those wind-driven currents might be enhancing the aggregation of bait in particular areas, or they might be reducing the aggregation of bait in different areas by destabilizing the currents created by river flow or by tides. As a general rule, though, most of the gun anglers that I talk to about fishing in estuaries would prefer to fish under windy conditions than under still conditions. And again, it comes down to that water movement, also stealth, I guess, having surface water ripple, particularly if you're fishing shallow for something like whiting or brim. Having that surface water ripple gives you a little bit of cover, makes it harder for the fish to see you, and they're less spooky. But you know that if you've got an eddy that's formed by flow, tidal flow or river flow, and then you've got the wind blowing across that, it's going to push and accumulate all kinds of debris and muck and junk and stuff that the fish love into a particularly tight area. And so that's going to increase the likelihood of having predatory fish there. Likewise, if you're fishing flats in estuaries, having the wind blowing across the main channel of the river and onto a flat, well, that does two things. One is it pushes all kinds of food and debris and all kinds of stuff out of the main river channel and into the flats where fish are likely to be hunting and feeding. But it also pushes warm surface water onto those flats as well and causes a bit of circulation. Because typically speaking, unless it's a massive tidal range, when you get into that shallow water, most of the water flows in the main channel of the river, and quite often the flats, there's not so much strong flow. There will be flow there, but it's often more of a rise and fall of water level rather than roaring flow over the shallow flats. And so the wind can play a really big part in that. Of course, the other place that wind can play a really big part in creating currents is when you're fishing coastal areas or islands or inshore reefs and that kind of stuff, fairly shallow water stuff, where there may or may not be tidal currents as well. So quite often if there are tidal currents, if you were to look at it on Google Earth or via a drone or something like that, you'd see channels and you'd see evidence of tidal movement having carved out flow paths for the water. But sometimes it's got nothing to do with tide and it's everything to do with wind. And headlands is a classic example of this. Because for all intents and purposes, headlands are very much like points in lakes. They're a place where if the wind is blowing across a headland, so let's say you're on a section of coastline that runs north-south, so you've got a headland that juts out to the east. Thinking of the east coast of Australia here, Western Australian anglers, just reverse all of that. But you've got a point that juts out, and you've got a southerly wind that's blowing from south to north. If that wind's been blowing for a while and it's been blowing consistently from the one direction, then it's been hitting that headland on the southern side. And what's happened is it's created a current that's running in the absence of tidal currents and rivers and that sort of thing, of course. It's created a current where the water's moving from south to north. It's striking that headland, and very much like a point on a lake, it's creating a bit of a pinch point. So on the backside of the headland, you've got an eddy going on. And you can sometimes see these as well. You can see flotsam, jetsam, debris, all kinds of stuff accumulated on the water surface, but that's also happening below the water surface. And so quite often predatory fish will be on the lee side of that headland, right on the interface where the eddy's formed and there's water flowing from south to north, but there's also water flowing from north to south. And that's what always happens when an eddy forms, is you've got this kind of slack water in between that accumulates all kinds of stuff, including bait fish. So the approach to figuring out where currents are pushing bait and fish in coastal areas is very, very similar to the approach you'd use in fishing lakes. You'd look at your Navionics to see what the water depth is. You'd have a look at Google Earth. You'd have a look and see what the wind's been doing over the last few days and whether it's been consistently blowing from one direction. You'd figure out what currents are likely to have been established. And then when you get on the water, of course, and you'd use your eyes, you'd look for those current lines, lines of debris floating on the surface, any kind of colour change in the water, all that sort of stuff that might indicate an intersection of currents flowing in opposite directions. Now, obviously the fish holding structure isn't just limited to points and headlands, right? So in your lakes and in your coastal areas, you also have other structures. So for example, you might have reefs or bommies or snags or whatever that the current is flowing over. So keep in mind, once you've figured out which way the current is likely to be flowing, you can figure out where that current break is likely to be at the front end of the snag and at the back end of the snag or the reef or the bommy or whatever it might be. And you know where those fish are going to be sitting. They'll be holed up in front of that piece of structure, or they'll be holed up just behind that piece of structure, but particularly in front, right? Because in front of that structure, there's a current break, there's a little bit of a quiet spot where they don't have to swim too hard to stay where they are, but they get the benefit of seeing food items washing down towards them and they can dart out and grab them. They will sit behind the reef or the bommy or whatever as well. It's quiet water there. Often the bait will congregate there as well. And sometimes the predatory fish will tend to be even a little bit further down behind that structure where they're waiting for those individual bait fish that just swim a little bit too far from the structure and get caught up in the current and get washed away and are easy to pick off. So look, for all of the reasons that I've just explained, when I approach a fishing spot, current is one of the first things that I'm going to look at, right? It tells me so much about where the fish are likely to be and where I'll find the feeding fish and the active fish, more importantly. So far, we've been talking about fish that are holed up in a particular place because they're looking for an easy feed. But there are some other factors that come with currents as well that are worth keeping in mind that can also influence whether fish are going to be there or not. And one of those factors is color change, water color and clarity that often come with flowing water. And this might be where you've got two water sources coming together. So you might have a main river channel and then a small feeder creek, as we have talked about previously in the top end of Australia. It happens all over Australia, though, not just at the top end. I guess I'm using the top end as an example because it's been well publicised and well documented on television, all kinds of things, so people understand what I'm talking about here. But you can have dirty water coming down the main river channel. You can have clean water coming off a side channel, a wetland, a swamp, some other kind of small river system or small catchment or whatever could be draining into the river. And so you finish up with dirty water and clear water side by side. That's always a great place to fish. And again, not just for barra. If you want to catch bass down in northern New South Wales, that's a great strategy. If you want to catch trout down in Tasmania, it's a great strategy as well. Look for those two different bodies of water coming together and they kind of sit side by side. They don't necessarily mix and you can see that colour change. It might be a change in colour from being clear to being tanned, or it might be a change that's associated with sedimentary material. So you might have lots of mud and that sort of thing stirred up in the main channel where there's stronger flow and cleaner water coming in from the side channel. Doesn't really matter either way, because effectively both of those scenarios are giving the predatory fish a place where they can sit in relative obscurity where it's harder for the bait fish to see them, and then they can leap out and grab bait fish at will without having been seen. It gives them that surprise, that ambush ability, I guess, is having that colour change. Once again, that is definitely not limited to river systems. So you'll see these colour changes in lakes. Look for anywhere where the wind's been beating the shore and you've got a mud line along the shoreline. These are great places to fish for bass, trout, barramundi, Saratoga, all kinds of different species get into that mud line for the same reason I've just described. In an offshore scenario, it can be coastal water meeting offshore water. So a greeny, bluey coloured water meeting a bright blue water, or it could be water containing lots of plankton and sediment and that kind of material meeting clean water. It could be upwelling, causing different bodies of water to meet. But again, the currents are causing different bodies of water that have different chemistry and different food items and different clarity and all that kind of stuff. It's a rich hunting zone for predators. So those colour changes and those turbidity changes, super, super important. Great opportunity for the astute angler to go and throw some lures in there with a good chance of picking up a fish. And I guess the other aspect is water temperature. And I've talked a bit lately about how sensitive fish are to temperature. It's one of the great drivers of aquatic ecosystems where fish have this incredible sensitivity to small changes in temperature. So half a degree to a degree in temperature change is a marked difference to fish. Human beings, we hardly notice a half degree or a 1 degree change in temperature of the air around us. Wouldn't even notice a difference. Fish really, really feel that. It affects their metabolism, it affects their feeding, it affects everything about their behavior. So apart from bringing food items, those different flows or the flow from different bodies of water can bring also different water temperatures. Okay, so again, we look at the offshore zone, we find the temperature gradients and we work along the gradients, right? in rivers, lakes, estuaries, we might be looking for places where there are patches of warm water. If we're fishing during the winter months, we're fishing first thing in the morning, water temperatures have dropped a little bit overnight and the fish are looking for a bit of warmth. Well, then look for those places where the wind is blowing surface water into bays, inlets, any kind of structure. The fish are likely to be there. And the same applies in reverse, by the way. You know, there are times where fish are actually looking for cooler water. During the summer months, it may be too warm. They're looking for cooler water, so you might fish those lee shores where the wind is actually blowing the surface water across a waterway and dragging cooler water up from underneath. So the fish might be in those places. But just understand that a lot of the temperature fluctuations and the temperature differentiation around a lake system, around an estuary, around a river, around a coastal area, inlet, bay, doesn't really matter. A lot of that is driven by currents, whether they're wind currents or whether they're currents brought down by the water. Such as, for example, if you're fishing in a river system beneath a hydropower dam, it might be releasing cool water. So you might get cold water currents coming down and warm water currents off to the side. And the fish can be moving between those, looking for their comfort zone. Now, the reason this is important is that fish can be using different parts of the waterway at different times of the day because they're looking for water of just the right temperature. So, for example, during really hot weather, they might stay in the deeper parts of a river channel where the water temperatures are cooler during the day. And then in the evenings, as the air temperatures drop and the surface temperatures of the water start to drop as well, they might move up into those shallow flats because the flats are more readily mixed and the water temperatures tend to cool faster in the flats than they will in the deeper channel. Or vice versa, if it's during the winter months, those flats might get too cold because the air temperatures are so cold, they might move into the deeper channels where the water temperatures are more stable and more consistent and they're not having that fluctuation of temperatures. So getting back to our original aim, our original mission of this discussion, we were exploring whether the theory that no run means no fun actually holds true. I think in most cases, it actually does hold true. And I think we've probably illustrated that with these discussions today. That's not to say that you have to have massive amounts of water movement, but if you don't have some water movement, then you don't have any accumulation and aggregation of bait. You don't have any incentive for the fish to hold up and find places where they can snatch an easy feed, and that makes it harder for anglers. Anytime you've got water flow, whether that's from rivers, whether it's from tidal currents, or whether it's from wind currents, you've got a good idea about where the fish are likely to be. It really narrows the hunt down. Even before you've hit the water, you can get a pretty good idea by looking at a map of where you might want to start. And then factor in those other things. We've talked about temperature in other episodes, so I haven't gone into it in great depth in this particular discussion, but go back to previous episodes where we have talked about the effects of water temperature on fish behavior. It can be really profound, okay? So think about that and the influence that wind and tide and water flow has on temperatures within a waterway and how fish utilize that. And remember that currents also bring opportunities for color change. So you have those areas where clean water meets dirty water or tannin-stained water meets clear water. Those sorts of areas always hold fish. The other thing is, remember that different bodies of water bring different aromas and scents to the fish as well. So you think about, northern hemisphere species, I know, but you think about salmonids, trout and salmon find their way back into river systems based on the smell of the salts that are coming from the catchment. They know which direction to swim when they're at sea because they're picking up minute traces of salt. So fish do pick up feeding cues from those smells that are brought by different bodies of water as well. You know that if lots of fresh water starts flowing into an estuary system, fish get a bit fired up. As the water levels start to rise in a lake, fish get a bit fired up. They can smell that water coming in. They know that there's something going on and that that's likely to bring them an opportunity to feed. So in that case, the flow is bringing different water chemistry. And I suspect this also happens, for example, with wonky holes. For those who are not familiar with wonky holes, they're essentially places where ancient riverbeds flow under the sea and they come up. They're like freshwater springs in the ocean. And generally where you find a wonky hole, there's a whole bunch, there's like an ecosystem around it, a wonky hole ecosystem, if you like. Lots of fish there. I suspect that fish can actually smell and they move from wonky hole to wonky hole because they can actually smell the fresh water coming through and they can follow that and they get in there to get rid of parasites. But also there's lots of food and nutrients and that sort of thing around wonky holes. And so they generally hold some good fish. So yet another example of flow having an influence over fish behavior and over fish aggregation and accumulation, I guess. So folks, lots and lots of food for thought there, but definitely the saying, in my opinion, no run, no fun holds true. Doesn't have to be a lot of run to have a lot of fun. In lake systems, that run might not be obvious, might be wind-driven currents that you can't even see. But if you don't have some kind of water movement, I think the fishing is always way, way tougher. So embrace that wind, get out there. And I know it causes a few issues with casting and that sort of thing, but I reckon without wind, we'd catch a lot less fish. And for me personally, and for many of the guests I've had on the ALF podcast over the last 5 years, who fish all kinds of systems for all kinds of species, a little bit of wind is always a good thing because it does create those current flows, gives you the opportunity to be stealthy and fires up the fishing. So, folks, that's it for today. I think I've downloaded my entire brain. I don't think there's anything left to download, certainly on the topic about whether it's true that no run means no fun. So I will leave it there and sign off, folks. Stay safe on the water, stay safe on the roads, tight lines, and I will see you out on the water sometime. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Australian Lure Fishing Podcast. For free show notes, downloads, tools and resources, please visit our website on doclures.com or consider supporting the show by joining Team Doc Lures to receive exclusive members-only episodes, tools and resources. But for now, tight lines and may the fish be with you.